In my early 20s, I felt God's calling to go into ministry, and I took time away from college for a year of missions training and then 2 years on the mission field in Australia, where I studied the Bible more. I prayed and witnessed and preached and led children's clubs. Our team directed evangelistic puppet shows and led Bible studies and did door-to-door evangelism, and I counseled kids at church camp. When I came back to San Diego, I was 25 years old, and I was working at a conservative Baptist church in San Diego as a youth intern. I was also working on an English degree and a teaching credential at San Diego State University. And one day, the youth pastor walked up to me and invited me to a conference called Hope and Healing for the Homosexual. And I was terrified. Not just because he was about 6'2" and had a crew cut, looked like a Marine drill sergeant, had played basketball for UCLA. My initial thought was, he knows. God told him. And I didn't even believe at that point that God talked to people. But you see, even though on the outside I was a good kid, on the inside for years and years I had struggled with my sexual identity, with same-sex attractions, and with pornography and fantasy. And I knew what the Bible said about homosexuality. I knew that it was a sin. I believed that God had created humans male and female, and that sex was designed by God for one man and one woman in a committed marital relationship. I believed anything outside of that was outside of God's plan. And I wanted to follow God, and I wanted a family. But I also had these sexual attractions for men, and I had them for years. And I didn't know what to do with them. And I'd hidden them for years. And I was tired. I was exhausted from trying to hide my feelings, from trying to battle these attractions, from my struggles with pornography. I was tired of trying to be good enough, tired of the internal battle, tired of trying to do the right things. So I went to this conference with the youth pastor, and there, for the first time, I heard stories from men and women who had come out of homosexuality. And I heard some reasons about why I might be having these feelings inside, some reasons that really made sense to me. I heard that change was possible, that healing and transformation were possible, something I had never heard in all my years in church. Within a week of going to this conference, I started seeing a Christian counselor, I started attending a support group, and I started telling people about my struggles with same-sex attractions. I thought to myself, I'll probably just work on this a couple months and then move on with my life. Little did I know the journey that I was starting. With my counselor, I began exploring some of the roots of my early gender confusion. As a young boy, I had really identified with my mom more than my dad. And I grew up with two sisters who I played with, sometimes played dress-up with, and closely identified with. I remember my parents' horror. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I asked for a Midge doll for Christmas. I really wanted a Midge doll. And I remember the conversations. Some of you are old enough to remember that Midge is Barbie's best friend, right? I remember my parents talking about this. I knew that they were worried about it. And after thinking about it, they finally gave me the Midge doll, but they also gave me a G.I. Joe doll. I mean a G.I. Joe action figure. There she is. My counselor and I also talked about my early experiences with other boys. Some of my earliest memories are of being sexual with other boys when I was 5 and 6 and 7 years old. And for me, one of the effects was that I pulled away from relationships with boys. I learned the lesson that if I get friends with a boy, if I get close to him, this will turn sexual. And I didn't want that anymore. I grew up confused and ashamed about these experiences. I remember praying for forgiveness over and over again and not feeling forgiven and worrying about that over and over again. I grew up lonely and disconnected from masculine relationships. It didn't help that I was small as a child. Well, I'm still short, but that I was small as a kid and that I was sick a lot. And Dr. Joseph Nicolosi, in his writing, talks about the kitchen window boy, the boy who stays inside and looks out the window at the other boys playing. And that was my story. I would sit inside and read books, which helped with school, but didn't help for connecting with other boys. I spent a lot of time alone. And just talking about these things with my counselor for the first time was freeing. The support group that I started attending was called Homosexuals Anonymous. You know, on the one hand, I was really embarrassed to go the first time I went. I didn't really know any gay people, any homosexuals, and I didn't know what to expect at a support group like this. But on the other hand, I felt relieved and grateful to find that there were Christians who struggled like I did. Homosexuals Anonymous, in their own words, is a fellowship of men and women who, through their common emotional experience, have chosen to help each other live in freedom from homosexuality. Now, I didn't know anything about step programs, except that I knew that most of them had 12 steps. And Homosexuals Anonymous, HA, had 14 steps. And I thought initially, you know, maybe that's because we're extra special, or because this sin is extra hard and we just need a little bit more help than anyone else does. But that's not the real reason. There are several big differences between HA and other step programs. First, Homosexuals Anonymous is Christ-centered and biblically based. And second, I didn't stand up at HA every week and say, "Hi, I'm Jeff and I'm gay." In fact, the very first night I attended, the group was looking at step 5, which reads, "We came to perceive that we had accepted a lie about ourselves, an illusion that had trapped us in a false identity." And for me, this was life-changing. I had spent so much time trying to suppress homosexual thoughts and feelings, trying desperately to not be gay. This had become a major focus of my thinking. And God used this step to begin to destroy that lie from the enemy, that my attractions gave me my identity, that my attractions defined me. The next week we looked at step 6. We learned to claim our true reality, that as humankind we are part of God's heterosexual creation, and that God calls us to rediscover that identity in Him through Jesus Christ as our faith perceives Him. What I began to understand was that homosexuality was not who I was. And even though I spent a lot of years and effort focusing on not being gay, not having lustful thoughts, not looking at porn, not being homosexual, all that focus wasn't really in the right direction. You tend to become like what you focus on, whether that focus is out of fear or hate or love. And the more I tried not to be gay, the more I wrestled with those same-sex attractions. God began to do a work on my identity at that point, setting me free from a false identity, being gay, and beginning to set me free to be the man that He created me to be. God was calling me into existence with a new identity and with new life. And as my thinking began changing about who I was, I thought, you know, I probably need to date some women. So I took a few different girls out, and in my misguided zeal, I would tell them almost immediately on the first date about some of my struggles with same-sex attractions and how God was setting me free. It's not a technique I recommend for the first date. Spilling all your deepest, darkest secrets and sins. And fortunately, these women were healthy enough to run quickly, nicely, in the opposite direction. I began to realize that maybe I needed to let God continue to work on me some more. So I continued to see my counselor and to attend the HA group. But change wasn't happening quickly enough for me, and I was still struggling with sexual sins. And healing and growth aren't always a clean trajectory. There can be relapses, and it can be a very messy and painful process. And sometimes that's difficult for the church to understand because we want it to be clean and neat. And this is not always a clean and neat road to recovery. For the first time in my